Modernization refers to the complex set of institutional changes happening at the beginning of the 19th century. Those include the development of popular sovereignty, industrialization, secularization, and eventually mass education, all transferring power from a small group of people to a larger group of people. At the same time, with industrialization, there is also much greater potential to turn the tables so that a small group of people can have much more power than any other elite did in human history. At the beginning of the 19th century, it looked as if the masses had a power advantage just if they armed themselves with pitchforks and axes. Because as long as you get a lot of bodies on a battlefield, bodies overcame technology. There are technological changes that happened in the 19th century around firearms that give centralized states an advantage, as long as they're willing to kill lots of people, over mass populations. One of the big changes that happened over the course of the 18th and 19th century is the development of common staffing. Commoners staff the military rather than nobles. The elites step back from the battlefield, and in their place, they train and equip commoners. To staff an army then meant to use universal conscription. Throughout the 19th century, universal conscription was adapted and adopted by almost every major European country. This made those troop numbers go up and up and up because European monarchs believed the more men they could put on a battlefield, the more likely it was to win. But they also realized that simply numbers weren't enough, that they needed professional officers, that birth no longer was sufficient for leading an army. Instead, European monarchs wanted professional officers, people that were trained in a military academy. This was one of the revolutionary changes that Napoleon introduced. He wanted his officers to know the basic skills of a fighting man and leading armies. So not just how to personally use a weapon, but how to coordinate soldiers on a battlefield. Because in a modern army, they're no longer warriors fighting hand-to-hand individuals in combat. They're soldiers working as a team, working for a group mission. That requires a team leader, that requires a professionally trained officer, just like a football team needs a good quarterback who knows how to look and read a field. There were two major philosophical schools coming out of the Napoleonic War. Both of them impacted battles in the 19th century. The first and most popular at the beginning was Baron Antoine Henri de Jomini, right? Wrote The Art of War. He argued that trained officers needed to know strategy. They needed to know grand tactics, right? So what happens on a larger battlefield? They needed to understand logistics, what type of supplies that their troops needed, how to bring up those supplies, how to get them onto the battlefield. They needed to know elementary tactics, what happens on a smaller scale rather than the grand scale. And they also needed to understand engineering. They needed to understand what type of road conditions, what type of wall conditions, what type of fortifications were you either need to defend yourself or you're going up against. These trained officers then needed to know all of the aspects of the art of war. But a well-trained army will then have officers that specialize in each aspect of the art of war. Some officers may need to understand the logistics of a situation. So you have logistical officers, you have engineering officers, where they get more specialized training in a particular field. And they're not just all officers. Jomini, though, taught using battle histories, real world scenarios. And so this becomes essential and a big part of officer training academies in the 19th and even into the 20th century. Military historians then start searching through old battles, looking at strategy, looking at tactics, looking at logistics, looking for engineering, looking at all the aspects so they could tease out a science of war from these individual manifestations of battles. But by looking at individual evidence, they can find then grand power patterns that this becomes a science of war so that you take all of the guesswork out of fighting. Because what he wanted to do is mobilize mass force, outmaneuver an enemy, deliver decisive strikes, and if you have multiple armies on the battlefield, have them interact with simultaneous action. This would then deliver a death blow to the enemy. This was imagined as what made Napoleon so brilliant. He had staff officers who were trained to create an army that operated as a well-oiled machine. Another military philosophy developing in the early 19th century, also looking at the Napoleonic Wars, was called Karl von Clausewitz, wrote Von Krieg in 1832. He was a teacher at the Prussian Military Academy, and so he influenced a generation of Prussian generals, including those generals who later go on to fight the wars of unification. And so what he said was war was a rational instrument of national policy. War was a tool. And so before generals got involved in a war, they needed to understand what the end game was. They needed to understand what they were supposed to accomplish. And if military force couldn't accomplish that goal, they needed to turn to the political leaders and say, you know, that's not the best way to accomplish this. They needed to do a cost-benefit analysis. This is how many soldiers this is going to cost. This is what the benefits are going to be. And if the cost outweigh the benefits, don't do it. Because war is an act of violence intended to compel our opponents to fulfill our will. Military officers should not be scared of death or killing. Death of your own soldiers or killing the enemy. Because that violence will compel the enemy to surrender or capitulate, because the victorious power will then get to decide what to do. But all of that needed to be calculated violence. Did an army have enough violence to bend an enemy? If a general believed that they didn't have enough power to do it, don't start a fight. Don't start a fight unless you can win. Which meant then, if I'm going to be a winner, I've got to build up my own army and supply my own army to have enough strength to have overwhelming force on the battlefield. The conclusion of all this then is war is maximizing pain, war is maximizing death. Because only pain and only death is going to tell an enemy to stop. So modernization then meant killing large numbers of humans on a battlefield and figuring out how to do it. At the early part of the 19th century, that meant just throwing as many bodies as possible, having go at it, figure out how to organize those armies, and the bigger army would usually win. Over the course of the 19th century, then modernization then also included improvements in firearms. The firearms at the beginning of the 19th century had developed 100 years earlier, a flintlock musket, a smoothbore weapon, muzzle loading, right, going in the top, with paper cartridges. These weapons were incredibly inaccurate. They were slow to load, and the black powder in paper cartridges means they're not very weather resistant, so they have limited year-round use. The best way to make these weapons effective is to have one army march up on one side and one army march up on the other, and then fire volleys at each other. But those volleys needed to be coordinated. There needed to be drill to make sure that the men in the front would step back to the back and the men in the back could come up to the front. It provided a very concentrated battlefield. But compared to wars at the end of the 19th century, these were not as deadly because the weapons were not as deadly. States did, though, begin standardizing parts and calibers of weapons. They realized that standardization allowed for manufacturing of parts and manufacturing of guns and bullets and ammunition off the battlefield, to create a magazine off the battlefield, and then have those supplies then delivered on a battlefield so that battles can continue to go on and you don't run out of supplies, right? That's logistics. In order to coordinate that activity, states across Europe then started setting up what's best called as an ordnance office or an arsenal system, where professional military bureaucrats place orders for arms and armaments with workshops. Those workshops then produce to state specifications, and the states that are able to coordinate manufacturing and deliver them to the battlefield in the most efficient and deadly manner are the ones who can win wars. So a war is not simply won on a battlefield, a war is also won with the state that can mobilize military might the best, which meant the most effective states, the most bureaucratic states, also become the ones that are more likely than not able to survive both an internal and an external threat. During the course of the 18th century, the flintlock musket was perfected, right? And so it was almost universal in your use across Europe. But over the course of the 19th century, there were small changes that gradually transformed that weapon. One of the first changes was the cap lock. Here you see the cap, which is a firing cap. It's the ignition system. This cap replaced the flint lock. A flint was a piece of stone that hit on a piece of steel, creating a spark. That had to have an open fire pan. This cap was then placed on the end of a tube. When the cap exploded, it was a little copper cap. The black powder, the small amount of black powder in that went down the rifle and then ignited the black powder and launched the projectile. This little cap, right, this little brass metal cap provided better weather protection and faster loading, because you still have to put the black powder down the top, you still have to put the ball down the top, but instead of priming a pan, you take this little cap out, you put it on there, and it creates a little more speed, so it gives a little more advantage. Claude Minié developed a rifle and ball in 1850s. He was a Frenchman. When his invention gets to America, it's often then called a mini ball, but that's the American pronunciation of Minié's name. This mini ball, you see the shape of it is different. It's no longer a ball, no longer spherical, it's conical. There are 3 rings around the end, the bottom of that mini ball. Those are 3 grooves around the bottom of the mini ball. That's where you grease it. It needs to have some type of lubricant so that it can go down the barrel. One of the problems with rifling, that spiral inside of a barrel, is if there is a too tight of a fit, that projectile can get jammed into a muzzle loading rifle. And so what Minié developed was that the caliber of this mini ball was just slightly smaller than the rifling. With that lubricant, it can be pushed down with relative ease and seated at the bottom. When the black powder ignited behind the mini ball, you'll see there's a little bitty conical shape right here, right? There's a little bitty cone inside there. When the fire or the explosion happens behind it, it flares out enough so that it creates like wings. And when those wings then close the gap between the barrel and the mini ball, where that made it go in easily, when it's coming out though, that wings then take it, grab the barrel and start spinning. That spinning motion makes it more accurate. So these 2 changes changed a smoothbore muzzle loading musket into a rifle that creates a spin. It's still muzzle loading. It still uses paper cartridges. This needle gun, developed in Germany, started changing how to load a weapon. You'll see it's bolt action, which allows to open the breech or the back end of the weapon. There's still a paper cartridge. The difference is this paper cartridge has a needle that pricks it. When that needle pricks the paper cartridge, it's the needle that ignites the black powder. That removes the need for a cap. The French then improved this weapon with a chassepot in 1866, which instead of having like a football type weapon on the left, that's where you get more in line with a mini ball, but instead of having that little conical shape, because it's breech loading, you have a tighter fit at the beginning because you're not going down the weapon, you're coming into the back, you're locking the breech with the bolt, the needle punches, sending the bullet out. This new technology increased both the accuracy and the lethality of weapons for infantry soldiers. Infantry soldiers putting large number of men on the battlefield with coordinated tactics, coordinated strategy, enabled governments to project their power, both internally and externally.